Hello, friends. This is Dave Hurwitz, executive editor at ClassicsToday.com, here to talk about whether or not the modern circumstances of recording, especially orchestral recording, often result in poorer sound quality and less interesting recordings generally from what we enjoyed in the golden age of the 50s and 60s, the early days of stereo, or even the early days of digital recording in the 70s and in the 70s and 80s, or the 80s and 90s. I think there's something to be said for that. First of all, I want to give a shout out to one of the commentators who posted a comment about this topic, which was very, very smart. What this commentator said was that the fact that so many of these recordings are done live without the opportunity to actually go into the studio and do these things under more controlled conditions results in bad sound, because things tend to be multi-mic'd to avoid audience noise, to highlight certain instruments. There's a lack of cohesiveness, a lack of natural amplitude, a lack of the presence of the room acoustic. I think all of that's unquestionably true. I really do. And I thought that was a very, very astute observation. So thank you for mentioning that. I really have to give a shout out to the commentator who posted it. But in a wider sense, there's actually a bit more going on that I wanted to explore, because you may recall there is a conversation, an ongoing conversation among classical music listeners and audiophiles particularly, about whether or not 78s resulted in faster tempos. The need to fit something on a 78 side, which was 4 minutes and 33 seconds long, as John Cage ceaselessly reminds us, determined to a certain extent the nature of the interpretation. I think in some places it probably did, and in some instances it probably did not. I don't think you can judge one way or another. One thing is for sure, there was a certain quicker general tempo thing going on in the early days of recording up until about World War II, after which things started to slow down. And some argue that the slower tempos are the result of having LPs, long playing recordings that had more recording time per side so that you could relax a little bit and fit more music onto a disc. Again, that may be true in some cases. It may not be true in others. I don't think it's possible to tell generally. But today, we are in a situation where I think we can make some comments on what's going on. One of them was what I just said, what this commentator very, very sharply observed, that the fact of the matter is that live recordings have a different set of circumstances, but there's a bigger point to be made, which is that recordings of live events are not the same as studio recordings. A studio recording, a well-prepared studio recording, is a unique and artistically legitimate object in its own right. That's the point I want to make, because when you think about it, what people are not doing anymore, because they're recording these things live, is they are not looking for the ideal venue in which to make orchestral recordings. We hear about these places, Kingsway Hall in the UK, which I think no longer exists, or the Empire Ballroom and then whatever hotel it was in Brooklyn that the New York Phil used to record in, or the constant search for a decent sounding room to record the Philadelphia Orchestra, or the way that halls were changed for studio recording by enlarging the stage, bringing the orchestra out into the past the proscenium arch into the actual main space of the room and spreading the instruments around that way, as, for example, they used to do in Boston Symphony Hall or Chicago's Orchestra Hall. Or, and then there were the orchestras that had very idiosyncratic sounding rooms that were very difficult to record. I mean, the Academy of Music. Today we have the Barbican, in London, which is as dry as dust. Mann Auditorium in Israel, also a notably dry sonic thing. Or the Rudolfinum in Prague, which sounds like an aircraft carrier, an aircraft hangar. Some of these very, very different rooms with different acoustics that pose challenges to engineers, which they sometimes overcame and sometimes they didn't. But when you had studio conditions, and that doesn't mean you're necessarily in a studio, it means it's a separate performance event designed solely for the purpose of recording. You had the opportunity to engineer an ideal sonic frame for the work, for the orchestra, etc. And so we don't really do that anymore. And one of the reasons those RCA living stereos sound so fabulous, or those Telarcs, the early Telarcs, sound so amazing, is because that's what they did. We had a group of engineers whose job was to make the best possible sounding recording as a unique individual alternative artistic product. It wasn't supposed to imitate exactly what a live concert sounded like. In fact, it was supposed to sound better. It was supposed to compensate for the lack of the fact that you weren't there in person, and to make somehow the experience more vivid or different or somehow as visceral as if you had been there. And so it's a very different aesthetic nowadays, because digital recording is, relatively speaking, so easy compared to the complexities of arranging a studio recording. You just set up the microphones and do what you want, and you want to get them up close, and you don't want to have audience noise if it's a live event, and maybe you'll do a patch-up session afterwards if you can, or record a rehearsal. But the real question is, what has that done to our perception of superb recorded sound? To a remarkable degree, what we regard as the most iconic and best-sounding recordings are not live recordings. I mean, from an engineering standpoint, they're not live recordings at all. They are studio recordings done by crack engineers who knew how to make them. You look at John Coleshaw recording Schulte's Ring and all the things he talks about the things they did to set up the microphones, to get the ideal sound, recording Benjamin Britten's War Requiem, these big, complex works that required, really careful engineering to make vivid and excellent sounding recordings. And then sometimes, as with the War Requiem, we have like a broadcast of the original performance, the first performance, and it sounds god-awful sounding thing you've ever heard in your life. It's just horrible. It's a cathedral acoustic. It's all wrong. It's a mess. And that's what happens. So today, I don't think there's any question that, to the extent that orchestras and record labels are relying on live recordings to present them, they are absolutely turning out a product which is less successful, less careful, less impressive, less professionally engineered than recordings past, studio recordings past. And the argument that, well, it's more exciting because it's live, just doesn't hold water, because some conductors, of course, are just as good in the studio as they are live. Others are not. But from a technical, sonic point of view, we're talking, not just interpretation, you wind up with far less interesting and exciting engineering, in my view. And it's worse, not just because of the fact that so many of these things are live, or they're YouTube broadcasts of live events and things. They just sound like what they sound like. And you have no choice. You're stuck with maybe a bad room. You're stuck with whatever you got. But also, because so much of this stuff is now streaming and is not made for the possibility, even the possibility, that it may be played back on audiophile equipment, these digital things, which have a lower level of resolution quite often. Sometimes they're lossless, sometimes they're not. But they're also inferior for that reason. The way people listen, if you only listen on little, earbuds and things like that, rather than on, top quality equipment, there's no incentive for the people doing the engineering to engineer the recordings for that type of playback scenario. So the whole streaming business also militates against the ultimate in sonic and engineering sophistication. And so I really believe that we have sort of opened a can of worms here, and that people are going to be saying, and rightly so, that the recordings that are coming out now, they may be excellent. It depends on the artist, doesn't it? Some artists really care about what their stuff sounds like. Others don't. It depends how much say they have, how much they care, and then what the engineers do. But chances are, for money reasons, because it's cheaper to do it this way, and because of the circumstances of performance, no one can afford to hire an orchestra, put them in an ideal location, maybe in another town, in another room, and record them just for that event. there's a lack of specificity and specialness, all the SP words, to what's happening in recordings nowadays. And if something sounds fabulous, chances are we're just lucky. It's not because it's anything anybody intended. They are living with the results of whatever happened on the day in whatever location it happened to be. And what's missing is intention, the desire to make the best possible product and to go to whatever lengths it takes to achieve that goal. That, to me, seems to me utterly missing. And I'd be curious to get your view of that. So why don't you feel free to chime in. And thanks again to the person who made this point in passing, because I think it's a really, really valid one and a very, very interesting one. So keep on listening, friends. Thanks so much for joining me. Take care.